Charming words from Jesus on Father's Day, right? Ripping apart household, that's what he came to do. We'll get to that in a minute, maybe. What I want to know, though, is where was that woman from last week who was laughing her head off because she thought she was going to have a child in her old age? A promise so ridiculous she couldn't help but laugh. That was just 3 chapters ago in the book of Genesis. And in the verses just before the ones Anne read, she had the son. Like, that's the part we skipped. She had the baby. Woo! But instead of laughing for joy, she's deciding to clean house. She wants that other woman and her son, also a son of Abraham, out of the house. Now, the backstory that we might not all remember is that way back when Abraham and Sarah were not having any children, Sarah gave her slave woman, Hagar, to Abraham for children. Because any children that Hagar had, the slave of Sarah, would technically be the child of Sarah. So if you remember the story from The Handmaid's Tale, Margaret Atwood did not make that up. But now, when Hagar had that child, her place in the household got way up, right? She almost supplanted Sarah as first wife. And so Sarah had to go down a couple of notches. But now she's had her own son, and she's back where she belongs. And she wants the other boy out. And Abraham does it, apparently with God's permission. But it's not wrong to imagine that he sent her out to die. And that's exactly what Sarah wanted. What's going on here? Now, the first thing I wonder is, could there be like another option here? Like, wouldn't it be okay if we just acknowledge that Isaac was the heir and Hagar goes back to her place and maybe Ishmael, her son, just becomes a slave as she is? That would save them, wouldn't it? Even better, couldn't Abraham just acknowledge that he has 2 sons? Maybe one more important than the other and one wife more important than the other? But couldn't they just live in peace, maybe? Or even more, couldn't Abraham have said, no, these are both my sons, and when I die, I'm going to separate my substantial wealth between them, and both of your households can flourish, and I can be faithful to both of these women. Like, isn't there some kind of both and that will get us out of this mess? Maybe. Except I think this story is one that keeps getting repeated over and over again. Sarah wants the other woman and her son out because she doesn't want him to inherit with Isaac. There is not enough for both of them. There is not enough. Not enough love for 2 sons, not enough money for 2 heirs, not enough trust and dignity and confidence for even a family to live together in peace. There's not enough. Does that start to sound familiar? Stories of people fearing there's not enough, and so they have to get their own. I got to get my piece of the pie, and I got to protect it from all the other people who want the pie. And so we build hierarchies where some people get more pie than other people. And then the pie holders start to fight with each other about who has more pie and whose pie is better protected. It starts to look pretty ugly. Now, we can call the pie money, especially since we just minted our first trillionaire in the world. But I think there's lots of different kinds of scarce pies. Love and respect, money and education, all kinds of things that we value but we think there aren't enough of. And so we set ourselves against one another to keep what we have. Might we have noticed that in ourselves ever? It might run out, so I better get mine while I can, and I better protect it so that no one else can get it. That doesn't sound much like the reign of God, does it? And I think we all know that in the process, a whole lot of people get thrown out into the desert. Is there not an alternative? I think both the readings today give us at least a hint of what that might look like. Even though God says it's okay for Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael off, God doesn't abandon either one of them. it seems that God can choose more than one son. That God can choose more than one people, more than one nation even. That God can reach out to a slave woman, a foreigner, an Egyptian, and speak to her. She's probably the only woman in the Hebrew Bible who gets directly addressed by God, and promise that her son too will be a great nation. God evidently has more than one promise. Last week we heard the shared origin story of Jews and Christians in the promise to Abraham and Sarah. This story today is the origin story for Muslims who trace their religious heritage through Hagar's son. What would it be like to imagine for Jews, Christians, and Muslims to imagine that God has more than one chosen people? How might we interact differently even now if we started to actually believe that? Then there's Jesus, and it's tempting to land at the end of the story where he's talking about ripping things apart, all the conflict that he's meant to bring. But let's roll it back to the beginning. And he starts talking about the relationships between disciples and teachers and slaves and their owners. Those hierarchies by which we control one another. They exist in the household sometime too, right? Fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, daughters-in-law. But what does he say about them? You don't need to make one greater than the other. It's sufficient if they're like one another. The disciple like the teacher, the slave like the owner. Could he mean equal? Could he be suggesting that maybe those hierarchies are not the way things work? That instead of imagining there's only so much to go around and so we got to arrange ourselves properly to make sure we get some and they don't get any. That maybe we could imagine ourselves all subject to the abundance of God. There's enough, more than enough to go around, more than enough money, education, more than enough love and dignity, more than enough houses to go around. We don't need to fight over them. But once we start thinking about that, wouldn't we start to think we would understand why the conflict starts in the household? If we spent our whole lives protecting our pie and arranging ourselves properly, wouldn't we get mad if someone finally said, that's a whole bunch of nonsense? There's plenty of pie for everyone. We could understand that maybe people start fighting one another until they start to believe that no, there's enough. A great abundance. Never going to run out. What would it be like to imagine for a moment that were really true? There's enough, more than enough, for everyone to go around. What would we like to let our hands unclench, to trust there's enough pie to share? Even more, what would it be like to help try to create a world in which we treat one another as if we're all more than many sparrows? The God who counts all the hairs on our head will, with us, make sure that everyone has everything that they need. And there's no need to fight over it.